We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
£1 million contract to re-equip the American Navy with Hawk trainers. British Aerospace say the order for 300 jets will guarantee jobs at their Kingston-upon-Thames factory into the next century. They'll supply the aircraft in parts for assembly in the United States, and Rolls-Royce will supply the engines. The deal will almost double the number of Hawk aircraft ever built. But already months in space. The Russians say the three coped well with their record-breaking stay in zero gravity. 237 days on board the space station Salyut 7. More from our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
They were launched into space on February the 8th. Apart from being the longest ever flight, it broke other records. During the flight, two of the cosmonauts, Leonid Kizim and Vladimir Solovyov, made 6 spacewalks, spending a total of 24 hours out of the spacecraft doing repairs and carrying out experiments. They received visits from other cosmonauts, who stayed a week and then returned to Earth. And they were resupplied with equipment by an unmanned vehicle. Today, as their multicolored parachute was tracked across the Russian plains, they experienced the force of gravity for the first time in nearly 8 months. After a somewhat bumpy landing, they looked dazed and tired, but glad to be home. Because they've been weightless for so long, they can't stand up properly yet. It will probably take them some time to readapt to gravity. They will now undergo a battery of tests to monitor how their bodies recover. The results of this research will help towards one of Russia's ambitions, a permanently manned space station.
United States Navy. It will secure jobs well into the 1990s. British Aerospace and Rolls-Royce have secured the contract to supply 300 Hawk trainer jets. British Aerospace, who will deliver the planes in kit form, get a £400 million contract. That makes it an even bigger deal than the recent Airbus contract by Pan Am. Rolls-Royce will make the engines. The deal almost doubles the number of Hawk aircraft built. The first planes are due to go into service in 1990.
It was nearly 3 years ago that the United States Navy first declared its interest in the British Aerospace Hawk. In November 1981, it was selected as the only contender to go through a final development phase for a new aircraft to train American Navy pilots to fly jets both from land and from aircraft carriers. The selection came after British Aerospace took a Hawk to America to be looked at by US Navy pilots. The aircraft had been made world famous by the RAF's Red Arrows aerobatic team and is now in service in 7 different countries. The selection of the Hawk was made in direct competition with the Franco-German Alpha Jet trainer, similar in size and performance to the Hawk, which has also won widespread overseas sales. But although the Hawk has been the only plane the US Navy wanted for the past 3 years, American forces' purchasing of any piece of foreign-made equipment is notoriously slow and difficult. Last autumn, the whole project was threatened with a 2-year delay when the US Congress began to make cuts in President Reagan's defense budget, and there were times when British Aerospace feared the contract might slip away from them altogether.
Once we'd won, in the teeth of not only American national competition, but international competition, and the aircraft had won outright, then it was quite obvious that we were going to get the national lobbies against us. And a lot of senators and a lot of congressmen, quite naturally, were protecting the industries of their own constituencies. And they were making a lot of noise about this great contract for the US Navy, basic training, that must go to the US. It can't possibly go to a foreign supplier. And yet we have managed to hold that off.
To make it suitable to operate from an aircraft carrier, the Hawk will be modified with stronger undercarriage and an arrestor hook. But the US Navy's final endorsement of this aircraft should give the Hawk a considerable further boost in world markets.
Central Kazakhstan. They've lived in the cramped Salyut 7 space capsule for a record 238 days and said they were quite sad to leave. It had become like home.
After nearly 8 months in space, the Russians must have been very pleased to see their spacecraft drifting gently down towards Earth, safe and sound. When Soyuz landed, there was a flash from the retro rockets to slow the craft down and a cloud of dust. It all went perfectly smoothly. The astronauts seemed a little blinded by the light, but showed few signs of discomfort as they talked to journalists. But after being weightless for so long, it was obviously very difficult to walk. The question of the astronauts' health was what this trip was all about. The Russians have taken great strides in the field of long-term space missions, pointing eventually towards either a manned space station or a very long-distance flight. Staying in space for so long causes two main problems: a loss of calcium, making the bones very brittle, and a weakening in the muscles of the heart because of the loss of gravity. And if man is to spend long periods of time miles from Earth, these deficiencies need to be monitored very carefully. The information the Soviet Union now has on this will be invaluable to them.
The celebrations marking China's 35th anniversary of communist rule have continued spectacularly. By darkness, 500,000 people were in Peking's main square for the sort of firework display China hasn't seen for years. The tanks and rockets of the military parade had changed to old-fashioned fun. The Soviet cosmonauts who landed yesterday after a record 238 days in space are having medical tests at the Baikonur Space Center. They're still walking with difficulty because their muscles were weakened by the long period of weightlessness. Doctors are also worried about the effects of this on their heart and lungs. In America, 7 astronauts have arrived at Cape Canaveral for Friday's launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The shuttle will help in a new British experiment to measure tidal currents off the South Wales coast. Lawrence McGuinty of ITN's Channel 4 News reports.
Swansea University's research ship Venturous has been sailing every day out into Swansea Bay to prepare for the shuttle experiment, an experiment that will involve the latest in radar technology. Until very recently, scientists have used this equipment for measuring currents. The yellow propeller is turned by the current, but deploying the gear isn't easy. One reason why they've developed the shore radar called Oscar. It may look like a row of parking meters, but in tests so far it's worked well. This aerial sends a radio signal out to sea. Because the waves on the sea are moving, the frequency of the radio signals that bounce off them is shifted, like the pitch of a train whistle changing as it recedes into the distance. 16 of these antennae detect the signal, bounce back from the waves out there in Swansea Bay behind me, and allow it to be analysed to reveal the minutest detail in the pattern of currents out in the bay. It's crucial information to many people. For example, oil companies choosing the best spot for their oil rigs. But Oscar has yet to be proved. That's where the Space Shuttle comes in. On its flight next week, the shuttle will carry a special radar, which takes pictures like this one. Next week, the shuttle will fly over Swansea Bay, allowing scientists on the ground to check Oscar's performance. One company is already interested in making a commercial version of Oscar if the shuttle experiment works. Lawrence McGuinty, News at 10, Swansea.
7 on the board. The launch went ahead on time just over half an hour ago. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, was watching in London.
The 5 men and 2 women make this the largest shuttle crew so far, and they're in for a long ride, 9 days. During the mission, one of the 2 women astronauts, Catherine Sullivan, will become the first American woman to walk in space. The preparations went well. There was some cloud which could have threatened the launch, but the countdown went ahead smoothly.
We have main engine start, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have SRB ignition and the history's largest astronaut crew is on its way.
The clouds gave some unusual effects as the shuttle soared towards space. Because there are so many astronauts on board, they know they'll have to be careful not to get in each other's way. Tempers have been known to fray on earlier flights. It's basically a scientific mission. Later today, they'll deploy a satellite which will help study the Earth's climate. Perhaps the most spectacular results, though, could come from the large cameras on board. One will photograph the Earth in such detail that individual houses will be seen. These photographs will help look for oil and mineral resources. A radar camera will probe beneath deserts, looking for signs of ancient civilizations and old riverbeds. Later in the mission, the astronauts will practice refueling a dummy satellite in the payload bay, so that in future, satellites can have their lives lengthened. The mission is due to end a week tomorrow, with a landing back at the Kennedy Space Center.
In Florida. In half an hour's time, it'll be flying over Western-super-Mare. The crew of 7, including 2 women, is the largest ever to fly in one space vehicle. They now face 8 days in space, with their main aim to increase our knowledge of the weather. David Chater reports.
This is the 13th shuttle flight, and it's a Friday, but there was no sign of any nervousness on the part of the crew. At 7, the largest ever to go into orbit. For the first time, there are 2 women crew members aboard. Because the conditions will be so crowded, they'll all have to make a conscious effort to avoid getting into one another's way. This is the 6th flight into space for the Shuttle Challenger, and this time it was on a borrowed engine. One of her 3 engines developed a fault with a high-pressure pump, so they replaced it with one from the Shuttle Discovery. But the liftoff at dawn today from Florida was perfect.
10, 9, 8, go for main engine start, 7, 6, we have main engine start, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have SRB ignition, and the history's largest astronaut crew is on its way.
Challenger has 8 days in orbit ahead of it. Its prime purpose is to survey the Earth, its oceans, and its atmosphere with a whole battery of cameras and sensors.
120-degree roll, altitude 11 miles, distance downrange 8 miles. Now to 65%.
And today, some of the best shots yet of the separation of the solid rocket boosters, which give the shuttle the initial impetus to escape from Earth's gravity. A satellite will be dropped into space from the shuttle's cargo bay with the robot arm in about 9 hours' time. It will study the amount of solar energy absorbed by different regions of the Earth. The manned maneuvering units will be back in operation on this flight, but this time they'll be carrying a woman. 32-year-old Catherine Sullivan will be making her first spaceflight and her first spacewalk. The spacewalk is designed to simulate what they call on-orbit refueling of satellites, transferring fuel to satellites, which will help to extend their life in space.
Challenger has taken off on its latest mission from Cape Canaveral in Florida. On board is the largest crew so far, 2 women and 5 men. Their mission will last 9 days. Here's our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
Catherine Sullivan led the 7-strong crew from their quarters to catch the bus to the launch pad. Next week, she will become the first American woman to walk in space. The countdown went perfectly.
We have main engine start, 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have SRB ignition, and the history's largest astronaut crew is on its way.
The launch came just as the sun was rising, creating spectacular effects. It's basically a scientific mission. A deployed satellite will help study the Earth's climate. But perhaps the most spectacular results will come from the large cameras on board. One will photograph the Earth in such detail that individual houses will be seen. A radar camera will probe beneath the deserts, looking for signs of ancient civilizations and riverbeds. The astronauts will also practice refueling a dummy satellite in the payload bay. Refueling satellites will eventually extend their working lives considerably. The shuttle mission is due to end a week tomorrow, with a landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
The American Space Shuttle Challenger has taken off without a hitch from Cape Canaveral. It's a record-making flight. It's carrying the largest crew ever, 5 men and 2 women, and one of them, Kathleen Sullivan, will be the first woman to walk in space.
This is the 13th shuttle flight, and it's a Friday, but there was no sign of any nervousness on the part of the crew. At 7, the largest ever to go into orbit. For the first time, there are 2 women crew members aboard. Because the conditions will be so crowded, they'll all have to make a conscious effort to avoid getting into one another's way. This is the 6th flight into space for the Shuttle Challenger, and this time it was on a borrowed engine. One of her 3 engines developed a fault with a high-pressure pump, so they replaced it with one from the Shuttle Discovery. But the liftoff at dawn today from Florida was perfect.
10, 9, 8, Go for main engine start. 7, 6. We have main engine start. 5, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have SRB ignition, and the history's largest astronaut crew is on its way.
Challenger has 8 days in orbit ahead of it. Its prime purpose is to survey the Earth, its oceans, and its atmosphere with a whole battery of cameras and sensors.
120-degree roll. Altitude 11 miles, distance downrange 8 miles. Now to 65%.
And today, some of the best shots yet of the separation of the solid rocket boosters, which give the shuttle the initial impetus to escape from Earth's gravity.
And nominal separation.
A satellite will be dropped into space from the shuttle's cargo bay with the robot arm in about 9 hours' time. It will study the amount of solar energy absorbed by different regions of the Earth. The manned maneuvering units will be back in operation on this flight, but this time they'll be carrying a woman. 32-year-old Catherine Sullivan will be making her first spaceflight and her first spacewalk. The spacewalk is designed to simulate what they call on-orbit refueling of satellites, transferring fuel to satellites, which will help to extend their life in space.
Telephone.
It was in 1967 that Donald Campbell died attempting to raise his own water speed record. At over 300 miles per hour, his boat Bluebird somersaulted and crashed. But now his daughter Gina aims to break the women's record with her new boat, Bluebird 2. And her father's famous mascot will be in the cockpit when she makes the attempt later this month on Lake Windermere.
Everyone says to me, Gina Campbell, are you related to the great Donald Campbell? And I've always said, yes. Now I'll be able to say, yes, I am. And I'm proud to be, and I hope my father and my grandfather equally are proud of me.
To break the record, she has to reach 116 miles per hour. Today, she settled for something a little slower on the Serpentine.
That's all for now. Our main news on important parts of the mission. Astronauts carried out delicate rocket maneuvers and focused an antenna which had been swinging out of control onto a satellite.
The American woman has been postponed until Thursday because of continuing trouble with the vital radio antenna on the shuttle Challenger. It wouldn't lock into place to send information back to Earth by satellite. The problem's been sorted out, but it's delayed the astronauts' most important job, Earth observation, by 2 days.
NASA's new Ariane 3 rocket succeeded today where the American shuttle failed earlier this year. It put 2 communication satellites into orbit 22,000 miles over the equator from its launch pad in French Guiana. The satellites, both French, weighed more than 2.5 tons, Ariane's biggest payload so far. The launch was an hour and a half late, delayed by a fault in monitoring instrument. But then everything went right for this 10th and most powerful Ariane.
4, 3, 2, 1, stop!
The 2 fuel booster tanks, which give the rocket its extra power, separated as planned 40 seconds into the launch. Even before the 2 satellites were safely in orbit 20 minutes later, the Europeans were talking of winning 30% of commercial satellite business from the Americans by the end of the decade.
In just under 10 minutes, it'll be time for Blue Peter. Before that, on BBC One, John Craven's News Round.
Fireworks and an appeal for the law to be changed. Astronauts on board the American Space Shuttle Challenger have been taking detailed pictures of the Earth's surface. Everything seems to be running smoothly now, but problems at the weekend meant the schedule for this mission had to be altered, and tomorrow's first spacewalk by an American woman has been put off until Thursday. The main aim of the mission is to study the planet Earth. There's a special radar camera on board Challenger which can take photographs in minute detail. But when the antennae connected with the camera were tested for the spacewalk, they didn't work properly. Mission Control decided not to risk the same faults occurring again during the spacewalk, so it's been put off until after work on the camera has been completed. Today, the camera will concentrate on 3 particular areas of the world. It'll gather information about the jungles of Brazil, where large areas of forest are being lost. It will scan the desert land of Egypt and Sudan, where the camera can penetrate below the soil and detect traces of prehistoric life. And it will study the North Sea, where scientists will release artificial oil slicks to test whether the radar can detect man-made pollution of the sea.
Which may have been damaged by cosmic particles. The fault in the cooling system has also been repaired, much to the relief of the crew, who were having to work in 90 degrees heat. Gina Campbell, daughter of the late Donald Campbell, has survived a crash similar to the one that killed her father 17 years ago. It happened on a lake near Nottingham, shortly after she'd set a new women's water speed record. Catherine Hunt reports.
It was just 2 days ago that Gina Campbell displayed her new boat in London. She'd planned to make an official attempt on the women's world water speed record next week on Lake Windermere. But tonight it was confirmed that her run today was a new record. She walked away from the crash unhurt. Also saved was her father's teddy bear mascot, which she insisted was rescued. Tonight she described how her boat somersaulted backwards.
I was aware I was going, and I was aware there was absolutely nothing I could do. I found myself leaning forward, and I thought, you stupid girl, that's not going to stop you. You know, and I'm looking at the sky, and I suppose for one moment I thought, well, here I go. The next thing I know, I was rather cold and wet, and I'm in the water.
It's still not known what caused the crash, which happened on clear water in good conditions. Miss Campbell agreed she'd had a remarkable escape, but said she'd no intention of stopping racing.
Everything was going well despite problems with the satellite that hampered their communications with mission control for 14 hours. Space officials blamed the breakdown on radiation from a sunspot.
It be extended a day so the shuttle can still land in Florida. The crew managed to sort out a faulty communications satellite, but ground control were left with a few crossed wires.
This is Houston Press Center. Do you copy, Chopper?
Hang up and try it again. If you need help, hang up and then dial your operator.
I love it.
And that's the news so far. Aboard the American Space Shuttle, final preparations are being made for this afternoon's first spacewalk by a woman astronaut. Catherine Sullivan and a male colleague will spend over 3 hours practicing satellite refueling. Mission Control is still watching anxiously the progress of Hurricane Josephine near the Florida landing site. It could delay the return of the shuttle or force it to divert.
3.5 hours floating 238 miles up, just outside the shuttle Challenger, practicing techniques for refueling satellites.
Catherine Sullivan's historic walk started just over an hour ago. She was the second to come out of the shuttle, and it'll continue until about 7:30 this evening. But like so many aspects of recent shuttling, this giant step for womankind hasn't been without its snags. This is the 13th shuttle mission, and amid a deafening chorus from the superstitious of "we told you so," things haven't been going too well. Nothing serious, you understand, just an awful lot of niggling little nuisances that have turned the schedule and the shuttle Challenger completely upside down. Catherine's walk with David Leistmer, for instance, should have taken place on Tuesday, but it was essential the special radar searching equipment could have 3 uninterrupted days to scour the deserts back on planet Earth in the hope of finding the sites of lost cities below the shifting sands. Now the spacewalkers are at last learning how to refuel a satellite from the cargo bay. The 7-person crew, the biggest yet, including Sally Ride on her second shuttle trip, have also had to endure a failure in the cooling system, which put the overcrowded cabin temperature up to 90 degrees, and that was enough to make anyone want to go for a walk outside.
The crewmate David Leistmer, and spent several hours carrying out equipment tests in the shuttle's open cargo bay.
Catherine Sullivan trained hard for her starring role in this shuttle mission. She's 32, unmarried, and by training a systems engineer. At the start of the mission, she led the 7-strong crew from their quarters.
Challenger today, astronaut Kathy Sullivan,
she said she
prepared to
felt
become
ready
the
for the
first American
spacewalk.
woman to step into...
Her fellow astronaut, David Leistmer, led the way through the hatch. This is his first ride in space. Catherine Sullivan followed him and became the first American woman to walk in space. They completed their jobs in the payload bay ahead of schedule, stowing an antenna which had got stuck and fixing a valve onto a dummy satellite. practice for the day when they will refuel a satellite in space. The astronauts are now back in the shuttle cabin and have begun tidying up for a return to Earth at the weekend. A hurricane near Cape Canaveral had threatened to hold up the landing by a day, but the shuttle is still expected to land on time on Saturday afternoon.
An American woman to walk in space has spent 3 hours outside the Space Shuttle Challenger. With fellow crew member David Leistmer, she's been testing equipment that's going to refuel satellites in orbit. They wore spacesuits costing $2 million each.
To borrow a famous space cliché, it was a giant step forward for womankind as Catherine Sullivan followed crewmate David Leistmer outside for what Houston calls a little extravehicular activity. For 3 hours, the two astronauts practiced the very tricky business of refueling a satellite from Challenger's cargo bay. It's an operation that Catherine explained as she was doing it.
And on the other hand, I can sight straight through between the fixed plane and the interleaf, and I think we just have an insulation problem.
Catherine Sullivan is a doctor of geology, and thereby lies the clue to this 13th shuttle's main purpose. Apart from rehearsing the role of Space Service Station, Challenger is using radar searching equipment to scan the deserts of planet Earth in an attempt to find some of the lost cities and settlements that lie beneath the shifting sands. In the main, the mission has gone well, although there have been a number of annoying problems which have thrown the timings out a bit. In fact, this spacewalk should have taken place 2 days ago, and there was a fault in the cooling system, which put the cabin temperature...
Challenger, carrying the biggest ever space crew of 5 men and 2 women, will land at Cape Canaveral in Florida any time now. Despite early technical problems, the flight, Challenger's 6th, has been voted a success, particularly for Catherine Sullivan, who became the first American woman to walk in space. We'll have pictures of Challenger's landing on our late news at 10:15. We'll see you then.
Is due to touch down at Cape Canaveral in Florida in just a few minutes' time. The crew spent their last hours in orbit photographing the Earth's surface. The 8-day mission included the first spacewalk by an American woman. NASA is hoping that damaged heat-shielding tiles will cause no problems on re-entry. At one stage, there were fears bad weather would postpone the landing, and we will have pictures of the touchdown at 7:15 on BBC 2 and on the main news later this evening. Florida, just 2 hours ago. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, reports on the 13th flight of the shuttle.
They'd spent just over 8 days in orbit and clocked up several more space firsts. The largest ever crew to go into orbit and the first American woman to walk in space.
We're seeing long-range opticals.
40 miles from home, Challenger was picked up by powerful cameras at the Cape. 15 miles out, he did a left turn to bring it on line with the runway at the Kennedy Space Center.
Velocity 730 feet per second.
The final approach was steep, fast, and accurate.
Range 1.3 nautical miles.
There had been one main disappointment during the mission. A jammed antenna meant they only got a quarter of the geological information about the Earth that they expected. But the rest of the mission had been a great success.
Mission Control, Houston, at 8 days, 5 hours, 24 minutes. The largest crew in the history of spaceflight is home.
Challenger, Houston, we copy that, Crip, and you outfoxed us again. You landed at KSC, but the beer's been sent to Edwards.
I don't believe it, don't believe it.
Men with sniffing apparatus checked that Challenger was free of fumes before allowing the astronauts out. After 8 days in those cramped conditions, they had just a little longer to wait to stretch their legs.
Shuttle Challenger glided home to a perfect landing at Cape Canaveral in Florida today. It had taken the biggest ever space crew 3.5 million miles in 8 days.
86 miles out, through an infrared camera, Challenger appears as a dot in the sky.
Sonic boom has been heard.
11 miles out, she turns into the correct approach for landing.
Left overhead, 190 degrees onto the hack.
Then drops out of the sky, flying over the marshlands around Cape Canaveral.
Range 1.3 nautical miles.
And once again glides to a perfect touchdown.
Gear down. Touchdown.
It has taken her just under 8 minutes to travel the last 86 miles of her journey. The return marks the end of another highly successful mission. The crew, including 2 women, was the largest ever to fly in a single spaceship. After 8 days, 5 hours and 24 minutes, they looked triumphant.
went wrong. The loss of the satellites, worth over £100 million, was a severe blow to NASA, sapping confidence in its ability to launch satellites safely using the shuttle. Now special equipment has been developed to help rescue the satellites. It'll be the first time that a satellite captured in space has been returned to Earth. In the last few weeks, the satellites have had their orbit lowered and their rate of spin has been slowed down. The Indonesian Palapa satellite will be captured first. Using a jetpack, one of the astronauts, Fred Hawke, will approach with a 6-foot pole attached to him, poke it into the engine's casing and lock it into place. Then, using his jetpack, he will stop the spin. The shuttle will approach and the remote-controlled arm will grab the satellite with the astronaut still attached and pull them both towards the payload bay. 2 days later, the same procedure will be repeated to capture the Westar satellite. Once in the payload bay, they will be returned safely to Earth. The satellites belong to the insurers, who paid out over £100 million when they were lost. They'll be refurbished and sold. If successful, the rescue will be a dramatic demonstration of how useful man can be in space.
And finally, Madame Tussauds has marked Ronald Reagan's...
was to rescue 2 stray satellites for the insurance group Lloyd's of London. It'll also put 2 more satellites into orbit. And that's the news at 1 on...
...have forced a postponement of the launch of the American Space Shuttle Discovery. It's now due to lift off around lunchtime tomorrow. The 5 crew are starting an 8-day mission to rescue 2 stray satellites. And that was the 6 o'clock...
Launching satellites, the shuttle will also attempt to recover them. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports.
After a last-minute postponement yesterday because of high winds, today's launch went perfectly.
10, we're go for main engine start. 7, 6, we have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery and the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space, and the shuttle has cleared the tower.
It's an 8-day mission. The 5-strong crew, including a woman astronaut, will launch 2 communication satellites and rescue 2 others. It'll be the first time that a satellite has been retrieved from space and brought back to Earth. The 2 satellites due for rescue were originally launched in February, but their engines misfired and both went into the wrong orbit. Watching the rescue from this room at the Space Center in Houston will be the insurance underwriter who paid for it, Stephen Merritt. Lloyd's carried most of the insurance on the satellites. When they were lost, the underwriters paid out over £100 million. The rescue has cost them another £8 million. But if it's successful and the satellites can be refurbished and sold, they'll get back a good proportion of their money. Special equipment has been designed to carry out the rescue. An astronaut will approach the spinning satellite and insert a 6-foot pole into its engine nozzle. Once it is inside, the astronaut will pull a lever and 3 latches will spring out, capturing the satellite. Using his backpack, the astronaut will then stop the spin. The satellite will then be grabbed by the shuttle's remote-controlled arm and brought back to the shuttle. The procedure will be repeated with the 2nd satellite. Stephen Merritt has literally millions of his syndicate's money riding on this mission. For him, it'll be a nail-biting time.
I'm very optimistic. I don't think anybody can be totally confident, as it's nothing approaching it has been done before, but I'm very optimistic that we shall have a successful outcome.
For NASA too, the rescue is crucial. A successful outcome will restore confidence in the service it offers to its satellite customers.
And you can see more about Lloyd's financing of the satellite recovery on Commercial Breaks at 8 o'clock on BBC 2 tonight.
5 astronauts and 2 satellites on an 8-day mission. Jeremy Hands in London reports.
It may not look like it, but this is the space age equivalent of an RAC breakdown van. Discovery's mission is to rescue the 2 satellites that went spinning out of control on launch last February and to bring them back for the insurers who forked out £140 million.
Go for main engine start. 7, 6, we have main engine start. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of Discovery and the first flight to retrieve and return satellites from space.
After yesterday's delay because of strong winds a long way up, all went smoothly today and Discovery's 5-man crew were blasted into orbit without a hitch. They will, during the next few days, locate the errant Palapa and Westar satellites, which embarrassingly chose their own course through space instead of the ones they were told to follow. Then, with the aid of jet backpacks, the crew will fly over, stop them spinning and bring them back on board. If all that goes well, the London insurer's bill will be almost halved. Even if the satellites come back for scrap only, there's enough titanium built into them to make that alone worthwhile. The shuttle will also launch 2 more satellites this trip that hopefully will behave better than their predecessors.
American shuttle Discovery are about to try to make space history. 600 miles above Earth, they'll be attempting to retrieve a stray satellite for the first time. 2 have been stranded in useless orbit since February, and much of the money for the salvage operation has been put up by Lloyd's of London, who hope to recoup space insurance losses by selling the satellites. Simon Cole reports on the operation, which will begin in about 15 minutes' time.
After a space chase of 1.5 million miles, the Discovery is within a few feet of the rogue satellite. Earlier, the astronauts relaxed. That orange globule is actually orange juice. Without gravity, not a drop is spilt. And astronaut Joe Allen was hamming it up. After countless jokes about his lack of height, he proved he can fit into a Discovery locker. The serious business will start in a few minutes' time, when Joe Allen will leave the craft with his backpack. Without a safety line, he'll attach a handle to the satellite using a machine called a stinger. Then the Discovery's mechanical arm will reach out and grab the satellite to store it in the cargo bay. During the 6-hour operation, Lloyd's of London will be keeping a close watch on developments, together with those on the ground in Houston, including Kristen Fisher, whose mum Anna is one of the crew.
Scotland Yard have a new...
has come to an end with a safe landing at Cape Canaveral. During a flight of more than 3 million miles, the crew rescued 2 space satellites. Our science correspondent, James Wilkinson, watched the touchdown.
After 8 days in space, the shuttle was coming home. Mission accomplished. On board, the 2 communication satellites it rescued from orbit. Because of clouds at the Kennedy Space Center, the landing was nearly switched to the west coast of America. But the weather cleared just in time. Commander Rick Hawke brought Discovery down to a perfect landing. The insurers had paid out over £100 million when the satellites originally went into the wrong orbit. Now they hope to get some of their money back. The first satellite rescued, Palapa, once it's refurbished, will probably be worth between £25 and £30 million, a little less than when it was new. There have already been several buyers after it, even, it's thought, the original owners, the Indonesians. The other satellite, Westar, is worth a little less than Palapa because it's known there is some damage to it. Third world countries and some big companies are thought to be after this one. Whoever buys them, the insurance underwriters are well pleased with their investment of £8 million in the rescue. And for NASA, bringing them back has been a space first they'll be celebrating long into the night.